My name is Vermel Hill. I am going to discuss online gaming for my topic today. I will go through a brief history of video games. I will also touch on some of the technology used to develop video games, and I will also touch on some of today's gaming systems and what they're doing for online and gaming through the network. And finally, I will discuss a controversial subject of PlayStation Network versus Xbox 360 and how both networks have been compromised and how they compare to the other based on their network security. So let's start with a brief history. The earliest video game was developed in 1947 by Thomas Goldsmith Jr. It was a shooter on what was called a cathode ray tube amusement device. Essentially, there was a contraption made of knobs and buttons as a controller, and essentially it would send light signals to a CRT screen, and it would simulate shooting an object or a projectile. If you think about the Duck Hunt video game for Nintendo, that the gun that came along with it that would emit that sort of light signal to the CRT screen to simulate the shooting. That is what the earliest game. It was untitled. It was unnamed. It was just developed on a whim by Goldsmith and Mann. And pardon me, I'm getting over a cold. By Goldsmith and Mann. And so that is the first documented known video game. The first commercially distributed video game was Space War. That was distributed with DCPDP-1 computers in 1961. Um, it was essentially a game that had the first was titled for one. This is the start, and you had two ships that would use graphical missiles to attempt to destroy each other while avoiding a simulated gravitational pull, which was in the middle of the screen. It is credited with being the first commercially distributed game because it was distributed as part of the package with the computer, the DUC model computer. It was just pre-programmed into it. It wasn't distributed as a cartridge or clearly not a disc in 1961. But since it was distributed with a computer that could be purchased commercially, it's credited with being the first commercially distributed game. Now, at that time, clearly, one in maybe 1,000 households, if that, had a computer. So it wasn't distributed in large quantities. Um, but again, it is a commercially distributed game. From there, Space Wars actually created a little bit of a if you can do it, I can do better competition between designers and programmers at various institutions. And they essentially went on to create Computer Space, which is the first mass produced and coin operated game. And that would be developed by the people who developed Atari. So that was another large step in video game production. Uh, from there, games would continue to develop into what people quite often give credit as having been the first video game in history now, which is Pong. Pong actually was created by the people who would develop Atari, and it was also distributed commercially, but it was distributed independently on a Pong machine. And it was the first commercially successful game, meaning, uh, like you're talking about 150,000 copies in the 1970s. That is a huge deal where basically video games didn't exist. So for that game to be able to do as well as it did, clearly was the first commercial success for video games. From there, I should say at the same time, a game entitled Maze War was created. Now, the significance of Maze War, because it wasn't distributed commercially, but it was the first game that was actually going to use the early networking concepts that we use today, if you will. And it was developed at MIT in the 70s, and it was connected over terminal servers using ARPANET. And it simulated essentially a first-person shooter environment. Now, at the time, genres for games hadn't been created, so it's not credited with being a first-person shooter. However, two or more users could connect through ARPANET, uh, be placed in the maze, and essentially you have to find each other. From there, you might have some obstacles in your way, and you would be able to shoot or destroy or send those light signals that we discussed earlier into your opponent, and he would be destroyed, if you will. So Maze War is significant because Maze War is in essence the first online game. From there, games would not develop much online. They would continue to develop immensely. And the development of games is important because it created okay, we've done this. Now what environment for gaming? Uh, you wanted to know what was the next game you could develop, how far could you push your processors, what could you do to make the gaming experience more fun, to make it more evolutionary. And there was also a number of inconveniences that came with the development of games. So that took us to the arcade age. Games were developed at that point in mass quantities, distributed in mass quantities. You had your Donkey Kongs, your Marios, your Street Fighters, and at that point, you saw really impressive strides made in game development. Um, Arcades were popping up all over the place, and it was a really golden age, almost, if you will, in video gaming. Uh, Now, the issues were obviously arcades aren't 24/7. Arcades weren't always in the best neighborhoods. Arcades weren't accessible to everyone, and as a result, you had to figure out, okay, well, what can we do if we can't get to the arcade? Um, so that led to people saying, well, hey, we can bring the arcade to us. Computer games were some of the earlier answers to that. They weren't quite up to speed with where arcade games were because of where computers were. If you think about the Apple II, that was out during the arcade generation. The Apple II, the Oregon Trail wasn't holding a candle to Super Mario Brothers. So therein lies an issue with computer games. They would later obviously step their game up, but the earliest answer to that was how to take the arcade to us was the early consoles with the Ataris and your Nintendos with the 8-bit systems and the Sega Genesis and other 16-bit systems, and it obviously would, as you know, grow into 32, 64, and now current generation games, which look like it's you and I just talking to each other. So at that point, games developed and began to answer those questions. They began to have those one-ups with each other. Okay, well, I developed this, or I've developed this as an answer to that. But the issue was still, how can we get people to play each other without being in the same room? More adults were starting to play, and as you know, an adult can't likely go to another adult's house for hours on end and play video games. Yeah, sort of sneak attack your fun at that point. So the answer to that was actually first answered by PC games. Early PC games uh, were really introduced in the late 90s, early 2000s on large scale. Games like Doom, first person shooters, games like StarCraft. Teenagers really gravitated to these games. I can remember my freshman year, um, and a lot of my friends would play StarCraft, and I had no idea what they were doing. We had our computers in our dorms. If you had a computer in the dorms, a lot of my friends were playing Craft, as they called it, and I said, "Well, I don't even know what this is," but this, and they were playing people in other dorms, or even in other schools. We were still playing PlayStation, and you had to still be in the same room. It was fun. It was definitely a developing platform, but it wasn't across a network. So that was something that started the growth of what is now a huge opportunity for online gaming. From there, console games would catch on. Obviously, you had multiple generations of console games. Two would obviously raise above, really separate themselves from the pack, if you will. Microsoft's X, pardon me, pardon me, and Microsoft's Xbox 360 of today, and PlayStation's PlayStation 3. Both are very network heavy. On Xbox 360 and on PlayStation 3, you can purchase games online. Um, Clearly, you can play games online. You can play games that haven't been downloaded to your machine. You can play hard media against another opponent. Now you can actually store games in cloud space online as well. So they've definitely caught up to speed, and network gaming and online gaming is not just for PC games, not just for mainframes or anything like back on the ARPANET, back at MIT. It is everywhere, and it has taken essentially a hold, and is threatening to replace uh, physical media, much like MP3s did with CDs. Um, so at this point, that's essentially where we are with online gaming. Let's discuss very briefly some of the technology that goes into it. When I was speaking of StarCraft and earlier maybe card games and tic-tac-toe type games, games that were sequentially executed, those games in the late 90s, early 2000s started out using P2P lockstep. The commands in P2P lockstep are essentially sent sequentially between two machines. So let's just take, for instance, a card game. Um, two machines communicate sequentially. I make a move, you make a move, I make a move, you make a move. Well, we're executing it sequentially because that's the nature of the game. Therefore, peer-to-peer lockstep was the perfect technology for that. As things progress, you have first-person shooters with multiple users are moving around one platform simultaneously as opposed to sequentially. So, a first person shooter, I'm not going to shoot at you and then you wait to shoot back at me. Or in a sports game, if I throw the ball, I don't have to, if I want to move around while you're throwing the ball, I don't have to wait until you're finished throwing the ball in order to make my move or shooting the ball or what have you. That had to be answered by something different, and clearly client server was going to be the best way to answer that. So now what you see on all games, even sequentially executed games, is they're all done on a client server. They address delays and latency and movement by doing things like essentially removing the dumb terminal field from your particular client and executing code in the client, sending it to the server, making it so that the movement was already executed prior to it getting to the server, and then the server would at that point register it and move it on through to the client. But it was already executed on your machine, so you didn't have those delays and movements. I experienced that when I played sports games a lot because timing is a big deal when it comes to sports games. Uh, so now online games are, as you know, strictly client server. So let's briefly discuss PlayStation Network versus Xbox Live. PlayStation Network was compromised in 2011. It was a large story across all media. They lost tons of money, tons of users. To date, no credit card information that may have been stolen has been used or abused. However, the fact that all of their passwords were compromised was a big deal. Xbox actually encrypted its passwords on their server. PlayStation Network used cryptographic hashes, which we know from the encryption portion of the class. They use a message digest to store the passwords. So while the passwords were not stored on their databases and on their servers as the plain text password itself, somehow their message digest was hacked and the passwords were accessed, and every single PlayStation user was compromised. Now, whether or not that team of hackers, which is still at large, actually gained access, or I should say, used the access that it gained to your account was one thing, but everything was in jeopardy. PlayStation had to distribute a ton of games as a result for free just to make up for it, and it was a really huge mess. Xbox has been compromised, but not to the level of PlayStation Network. PlayStation Network does give away more free services, and that is what was thought to be the reason for maybe them having a less secure network. None of this has been proven. Obviously, it's a competition, PlayStation Network versus Xbox, but that's something that's going to be ongoing. They have very similar architectures, but Xbox did use encryption, whereas PlayStation used Message Digest. That's going to do it for my presentation.